If you are using containers and just starting with Azure, you should definitely check out Azure Container Instances. This is Adam, and today I will give you a brief introduction on how can you use Azure to host your containers in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned! Before we start with what container instances are, let's talk about what are containers. Containers is a standardized unit of software. What this means is just a packaged software that should be able to run reliably between each another computing environment. So that sounds very similar to what virtual machines are. So let's talk about first, what is the difference between virtual machines and containers. So in case of virtual machines, there's always a host. The host is created from the infrastructure, on top of which there's a hypervisor running. This hypervisor is responsible for hosting virtual machines and managing them. So there's always a virtual machine on which you always have something called guest operating system. So therefore you need to virtualize an entire operating system for you to be able to host your application. And you need to do that again for every single application. When it comes to containers, you also have a host. That host again has infrastructure. But what's different here is, first of all, you have host operating system, on top of which there's something called runtime. This runtime is responsible for hosting and managing containers. But what is good here is that from here onwards, you can just host containers. You no longer need that guest operating system for each application and each container, therefore releasing a lot of unnecessary resources and as such allowing you to host more containers in more applications. So the main differences here are, first of all, there's less development overhead. So your developers don't need to create they don't need to create those images for virtual machines, which takes a lot of time. Creating containers take just minutes, and if you know and you have already prepared scripts, in just a couple of seconds. And as you've seen, there's no guest operating systems, so there's much less resources consumed. Which also means, since there's no guest operating system loaded into the container, the file itself is in much smaller size. It's from hundreds of megabytes down to 20-30 megabytes of size. Since the small size is there and the less consumption is required, that means they also are starting up faster. You can get your containers running in just seconds. And because you're not running that OS, this again means there's much less updates that you need to do. Therefore, there's a reduced and simplified updating process that you need to implement for managing your application. So Container Instances is a service in Azure, a most simple service for running containers without managing any infrastructure and in just a couple of minutes allowing you to start your own containers and host them in Azure. So first of all, how does it work? Always there's a virtual machine underneath it. But this virtual machine is organized into something called container group. Container group is just a grouping of multiple containers where you can host multiple applications. So you can have multiple applications, each can have its own share if it needs a persistent storage, or it might not need that, so it's an optional thing. But each application can also expose a port, like port 80, port 5000, and if you need, you can expose that port further to allow for public connectivity, which allows you to get a public IP and a public DNS name for your container, so a public connectivity can be established. This way, you can actually host your web applications using containers in Azure in just a couple of minutes. So what are the key benefits? First of all, fast startup time. ACI can start up your containers in just few seconds. This time of course depends on how big the image that you created is, but usually it's just a couple of seconds. You can get that public API and DNS name that we were talking about if you need the public connectivity. There are multiple custom sizes of virtual machine that you can spin up to host your container group. So this is the custom sizes. And again, all the containers can be hosted on both Windows and Linux virtual machines, which allows you for great flexibility. Linux would be recommended way to start off, but if you have that very custom, very specific need, there's always a Windows container. You can get persistent storage, we already mentioned that. You can do this through the file share, but there are a couple more options available. And lastly, one of the key benefits of ACI is that you can actually deploy your containers within virtual network. This allows you to connect to those firewall protected and on-premises resources. So we can actually go to demos now. I have 3 demos prepared for you. The simple web application, in which I will deploy out-of-the-box ready container with very small Node.js web application. Second of all, the second demo, I will change that image and create a custom image with my own Node.js application, and I will deploy this to Azure Container Instances. And lastly, I will create a scenario where I will use container with a batch job that will calculate some words for me. This will be an example of one daily small job, a very often scenario in our real-life applications. So let's go into the portal. So in the portal now, we can go and start creating our container instances. To do so, we click on this plus to create resource. We type container instance. We hit create. And as always, we need to provide a resource group. I always have one created for the demo. And I need to provide a container name. So this will be my container group name actually. So I'm just gonna give it a name, amdemo4. The name doesn't matter, but it's fine. I'm gonna give it a region, and North Europe is always the closest data center to me, so I'm just gonna leave it. My image type is public. This is a name, this is where the image is currently located. I will be using a public container registry from Microsoft to get a Docker image. So what I will do, I will copy paste the URL to this image. So this is Microsoft Container Registry at microsoft.com from the Azure Docs, and this is ACI Hello World latest version. So this is the container containing Node.js application with simple Hello World. And this container registry is public, therefore I'm just leaving this as public. Next is OS type. I'm just gonna leave Linux. And next, I'm just gonna leave 1 vCore and 1.5 gigabytes of memory. If you go to the next tabs on the networking, you see that we have exposed port of 80 over TCP, and we're gonna get public DNS, public IP. But if you want public DNS, we can also get that. So let's type amdemo4. This is currently available, so I'm just gonna review. Looks everything fine, and I'm gonna hit create. So I'm just gonna wait. This takes about a minute or 2. The deployment is complete, so I can go to my resource, and this is how it looks. In the portal, there's not a lot actually that you get, because as I said, this is most simple service. So first of all, you have that IP address that we're talking about. So you can copy paste that into the browser and see our simple web application running on Azure Docker. So, and the second one, you can also use DNS instead of the IP, and you get the same result. That was super simple and super easy to run. So this is the container instances service. The current status of this group is running. Within that group, you can review what kind of containers are currently running. So this is our amdemo4 container. It's running from the image mcr ACI Hello World. The current state of that container is running. That's the rest. That's the start time and the restart count. In case it's gonna be failing, there's gonna be multiple restart counts here. You can review the logs for your container. You can review properties of your container. You can check the internal logs of the server. You can even connect to it, to the bash, and run some commands if you need to. One of the coolest things about container instances that it also allows connectivity through managed identity, but it's currently in preview, so I'm not gonna cover that today. So that was the demo 1. It was as simple as this, just creating the container instances service and passing the URL of the public container registry. So let's do second demo, in which we're gonna create a custom image. To create a custom image, we need a place to work on that image. So what I'm gonna do for today, I'm actually gonna use Cloud Shell. Cloud Shell is amazing to do this kind of stuff, especially if you're learning. I will have a separate video on Cloud Shell in the future, but for now, let's just follow this through. First of all, we need a mounted storage in order to work with Cloud Shell, because we'll need a storage where we're gonna work on our files. So I'm gonna hit create storage, and you might actually expect to get this error, because what it will try to create a storage in this kind of resource group. I don't have that resource group currently available, and I don't have permission to do so. So if you encounter this error, just click Advanced Options and select Use Existing Resource Group and create cloud storage here. So I'm gonna call it amstore01. And I'm gonna do the same for the file share. I'm gonna hit Create Storage. After about 45 seconds, my storage container was created and I'm able to use Cloud Shell. So in the Cloud Shell, what I will do right now is I'm gonna clone the Git repository of the container we just deployed, the Hello World ACI demo. So I'm gonna paste in the URL, git clone. So I'm cloning the repository. I will actually open it. So let's see, what do we have? We have a folder ACI Hello World. Let's go into that folder. One of the cool things about Cloud Shell is that you can open a very small editor that looks very similarly to Visual Studio Code by typing code. In here, you get that editor and you can review it. Let's maybe change the font size a little bit bigger. Actually, sorry, that changes only the Cloud Shell. So in here, you can actually navigate through those files. You can do a lot of stuff, but what I want to show you is, first of all, the folder structure. You have an app folder within which you contain your Node.js application. So this is the index file that you've seen. Welcome to Azure Container Instances, and the image. So what I will do, I will actually replace the default image and type custom images, just to prove a very small demo with Node.js. What else do you have in this folder is index.js file. This is the Node.js starting file, which will basically initialize your web container and start with index.html file. You have, of course, the packages definition for Node.js as well, and a Docker file. So this is a Docker container, and it basically states that we're running Node application, from which folder, what is the working directory, what to run and install all the packages, and do all that kind of stuff. But since this is not a demo about the Docker itself, I'm gonna leave it here. So since we already did our change, we can close the editor. You can do it by hitting close editor here or hitting Ctrl Q and running another command. So what we will need right now, in order to run this command, we will need to actually host our custom image somewhere. To do so, we need something called Container Registry. I will very briefly show you Container Registry today, because this is not the training about Container Registry at all. So I will just briefly create it. To create it, we again hit Create Resource, type Container Registry. Container Registry is Azure service for hosting containers for more than just Azure Container Instances. You can use it also with Kubernetes service, Service Fabric, and many other services. So I'm gonna install a name. I'm gonna call it A4E, ACR for Azure Container Registry. I'm gonna select a resource group. Again, North Europe, everywhere, everything that I host is there. So I just want to be close as possible. I'm gonna hit enable for the admin user, because this is a private repository. I'm just gonna need an admin user to connect to it. I'm gonna pick basic tier and hit create. So right now we are deploying a service which will allow us to build a Docker container and host it. Since this finished very quickly, we already have A4E ACR container registry. So let's go back to our code. Since we already have our code and we changed our application to our liking, we can build the container. To do so, we can use a command from the Azure CLI, Azure Container Instance Registry build from the image called demo, custom image demo version 2. We can actually change that version if we want. This can be a version 1 to the registry called, in our case that was A4E ACR, and from the file Docker file. So let's run this command. In 29 seconds we were able to send the entire Docker code, build it, and store it on Azure Container Registry. If we go back to Container Registry into repositories, you will see our container image stored. So if we have that stored right now, we can actually click on it, see that our version 1 is there, and there's our URL to the container. So let's close this command shell. We no longer need it. Let's create new resource, type container instance, hit create, and in this demo, I'm gonna create new container instance. This is gonna be demo 5. I'm gonna also host it in North Europe. This time it's an image type private, so I'm just gonna paste the image. Sorry, that's not the one. Let's copy this comment here. So the image name is this full URL to your container registry and the name of the container. Since this is not a public registry, we need to hit private, go back to our container registry, go to access keys, and first of all copy the login server, paste it here. You need also the username to connect to, so let's copy the username. And lastly, we need a password, so let's copy the password. Let's leave this Linux and also the size as default. So let's review and create and hit run. And we're done. So we can actually go to the resource, copy our API and open it in a browser. And again, this was our custom built image and it just took us a couple of minutes. So let's go for the very last demo for today. Let's open our resource group and let's create the very last container instance. Let's hit create. And for the very last demo, I'm gonna call it demo 6. I'm gonna provide it with public image from Microsoft. And this one is gonna be ACI word count. This image contains a code that does a batch job based on the parameters that we specify. This job will go through the Shakespeare novel and count how many words of length X, that is also a parameter, is within the novel and return the most commonly used ones. So let's see how this works. So we provide this image name, but what we also need to do, we need to go to networking, but actually to advanced tab. In advanced tab, you are allowed to specify environment variables. This batch job requires 2, a number of words, in which case we're gonna specify 8, and the length. What is the minimum length of the words you're looking for? I'm gonna specify 6. So what the script will do now as a batch job, once it's running, it will find the 8 most common words in an entire novel that has minimum length of 6 characters. So let's review that and let's hit run. So the provisioning finished, we can go to the resource, check our status is succeeded. This is different than the last time that we had running. That means all the containers within this container group finished their jobs. So if you go to containers, you see that our container has a state of terminated. You can review the logs, but what is most important, besides those events here, is the log itself. Within the log, you have the output of your batch job. So we have our 8 words with minimum length of 8, and how many occurrences of those words were in the Hamlet Shakespeare novel. So in this case, we were able to run a batch job using containers, and we're just paid for the execution time, which is very cost effective. This is why container instances are one of the serverless options for running containers in Azure as of today. As you see, this allows you to cover all kinds of scenarios from the ETL through batch jobs and even web hosting scenarios in Azure using Azure Container Instances. So let's recap. First of all, we did 3 demos. 1. Public custom image web application from Microsoft. Second of all, we created our own image and hosted it on Azure Container Instances. And third, we used custom images to create a batch jobs that we executed on demand. This is how powerful this service is and how can you use it in your real scenarios. That's it for today. If you like the video, hit thumbs up. If you really like the video, leave a comment and subscribe if you want to see more, and see you next time.